This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Orford with Myrene Cook, and we are here to do a deep dive into the Bowman Doyle murders. So just to provide some background, I met Myrene, a month ago?
Yeah, I think it's only been a month.
It's only been like a month, and I had just watched the Netflix documentary that you happen to be a part of.
Yes, Into the Fire, The Lost Daughter.
Yes, and we were just having a discussion about that, and Myrene was so fantastic and so engaging, and then obviously so knowledgeable because she was the prosecutor in that case, that I was like, you would be incredible. It would be incredible to have someone like you on a podcast just explaining some of these details from the perspective of a prosecutor. And she had said something to the effect of, oh, that's something that I always wanted to do. And instead of just, letting it end there, we stayed in contact and decided to start a podcast where we do a deeper dive into that case. So this first season will sort of cover this case and go over some of the details that weren't shared, in the documentary, and just giving people a perspective that I think is so amazing. And we'll jump right into it in a minute. But I also wanted to say it confirmed my belief when I saw Myrene give testimony in committee, and just absolutely she was a rock star. She was amazing in her testimony and was able to convince a few groups that were keeping our bill from getting voted out of a committee. She was able to convince them with her knowledge of the law to change their minds and to take a position that allowed us to get the bill that we were working on voted out of committee. And I was like, yep, she's the right person for that.
John, I really appreciate all of that. And I think at some point I'm going to get you to write it all down so I can read it over and over.
I would be happy to do that. Or we can just play this little clip for you over and over again. You just play it when you wake up in the morning. You're like, I am amazing.
That works too. It'll be my morning mantra.
Yes, that's a great morning mantra. I'm going to have to adopt that practice myself. So let's jump into it. This first episode, we wanted to sort of focus on an overview of the Bowman Doyle murders. So I really wanted to emphasize, what's going to set this podcast apart from other true crime podcasts. And there may be other podcasts in the realm of true crime podcasts that have prosecutors. I just don't listen to them and haven't listened to them. And I feel like most of the popular ones don't. But I think your perspective is fascinating because you get a more detailed look, especially at this case that you were so intimately involved with, than the average person. So from a prosecutor's perspective, why should listeners care about a deeper dive into this case rather than just what they hear in the headlines?
Well, the most important thing about any of these cases that we're going to talk about, whether the ones I'm involved in directly or not, is there's always more to the story than what the media reports. The media reports a quick soundbite most of the time, and it's something that may try to catch attention, which is great. That's a great way to get into it. But there's always a deeper understanding of what happened in the case, a deeper part of the investigation, or quite honestly, just looking and focusing on the people who did the investigation and handled the case, because ultimately that's really an interesting aspect of the whole entire situation and the case itself.
And in this specific case, what did Into the Fire not get quite right, or what did you wish was portrayed better than it was in the documentary?
I think the documentary did a great job focusing on the details of everything, but the focus of it was more so on the biological mom, which was her story, and that's very important to share all of that. But I think it's important, too, to look at the investigators and all of the work they'd done leading up to the location of Aundria Bowman's body. And then as we prosecuted the case, I think it's important to look at that as well, because without all of those pieces working in concert, we would have never had the success we had in that case. And I would say probably the same for the Kathleen Doyle murder in Norfolk, Virginia. they had to work the same way on their end of it with
Yep.
Dennis Bowman.
Yep. And in your opinion, how does media portrayal of the Bowman Doyle murders shape public understanding?
Well, I think when there are certain facts that are emphasized in the media on any kind of case, or even politics itself, those are the things people tend to focus on. But there's always more to the story. It's sort of the behind the verdict of it all, behind the scenes of it all, that I think really, truly needs to be shared with listeners who want more of a deeper dive into the cases.
And can you recall how the case was framed in the media? Like, it's gotten a decent amount of media attention, right? People Magazine, Netflix. You had mentioned a group out of England who's doing like it's their own documentary related to the case. Like, in your mind, can you recall like how that case was framed, and if there was anything that you think was, and I know you had mentioned earlier, getting other perspectives outside of the biological mother's perspective, but is there anything else from those other media outlets that in your mind changed how you see the case or how you think that the case should be portrayed?
You know, as a prosecutor, when you're actually involved in the case itself, I don't often watch or listen to the media that's talking about my case. I don't want to know what they're saying. I want to focus on what I know is the truth, what I know are the main facts. So it's always interesting to me to look back at a circumstance or a case in the media and see exactly what they were talking about. Like, what did they focus on and when? This case, as you said, has been in not only the Netflix documentary. I interviewed for another documentary on the same case. I've had articles in People Magazine, in a UK magazine. And so it's generated a lot of interest. And I think, you know, one of the ways that this case is so incredibly unique is basically how they were solved, right? And I think that's one of the most important factors I really want to focus on and tell more about.
Yeah. And we're excited to get into all of that. I think there's going to be an interesting, story told through these next few episodes that we would love to have people engage with, and we want to give people the opportunity also to reach out, to ask questions, and we probably primarily answer those questions through social media is the plan. But there will be an opportunity at the end of this season to just get all of your questions in. We're going to take the best questions that we've gotten over the course of the next month or so, compile them into, an entire episode just to get those addressed.
You know, I think the best thing about allowing the questions is you and I can think of the things we might want to know,
Yeah.
but it's really interesting to see what the public might want to know. There was a change in laws a few years ago that when I'm in a trial, the jury can actually write down questions. The bailiff gives it to the judge, and then we have to verify whether it's appropriate pursuant to the law and the rules of evidence and everything else that governs a trial.
Who gets to decide that?
The judge does.
Okay.
But it's really kind of cool because you see what they're focusing on. And it's helpful to know, like, okay, I need to frame my next series of questions around this type of thing because this is what they're looking at.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great thing for us to do here. I want to know what our listeners want to know more about.
And I think it'd be super interesting in a jury case because, I mean, you can really start to, wouldn't people start to shape their arguments around the questions that they're getting from the jury? I mean, it would make a lot of sense. But then I guess, do you know that it's coming from the majority or it's just an individual? Like, do they have to convene as a body to decide, like, okay, these are the questions we're going to send in? Or do individuals get to privately send in their questions to the judge?
They literally just have a legal pad in front of each juror,
Okay.
and they write down a question, hand that piece of paper to the bailiff, and there may be one, there may be 12. It just depends on how many people have questions. But I think one of the great things, too, is it allows, the court to say, we can't ask that question based on the law. And so it's maybe something that doesn't linger in their mind going, why didn't this prosecutor ask what their prior, for example, criminal history is? Because the law doesn't let me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's helpful too. But to know what they're thinking as they're processing all the evidence is really an amazing thing for the attorneys in a case.
Yeah, and why wasn't that legal?
It was just a law change that allowed it. It's been that way for several years. I can't remember exactly when it changed. It seems like forever at this point, but it's been incredibly helpful.
Are there times when the media, and I don't know if that was the case with these specific cases, was there a ton of media coverage or focus while the investigation and everything was ongoing, or did that not really come until after?
I think most of the focus came after charges were authorized, by Norfolk and then by us in Michigan.
Yeah.
Up until then, you want to kind of keep it quiet because you're investigating and you don't want to necessarily let the cat out of the bag that, hey, you're looking at these people or you're looking at this circumstance or situation. So you got to kind of keep it a little bit quiet then.
So in cases where there is a ton of media coverage before things are like fleshed out, that does have a negative impact, you would say?
It can be difficult because, you're going to be looking at jurors from your jurisdiction. And if it's in the media and they're looking at it, whether on TV, social media, or radio, you don't want them to start shaping their mindset of what they believe is the case before all the evidence is out there.
Yeah.
And so sometimes media coverage can affect how that goes. We want to find 12 impartial jurors, and that can be hard if they've had a lot of exposure to what the media says happened.
I'm trying to, without giving too much away, I know we want to just focus on an overview, but is there a part of this case that you believe is just, what's the most misunderstood part of this case? Like, what do you want people to understand about this case that they may not understand if they've only watched Into the Fire, for example?
I don't know necessarily there's anything that's misunderstood, but I certainly think two things, really. The first is the focus should be on the victims, more so than the heinous perpetrator who did these things. And so usually when I talk about it, I'll say the names of the victims, Aundria Bowman and Kathleen Doyle, and then I'll say the defendant or the convicted murderer, because I don't want to give any extra anything to the person who did these crimes, right? I don't want to give him any more notoriety than he's already got. But the focus should be on the victims and what they lost and what their families lost, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, I do truly think that a chance meeting between two detectives from two different states working on two different cases is really what solved this case ultimately. There were a lot of other factors that played in, things with the biomom. She did a lot of things that were very, very helpful. But ultimately, it was that chance meeting. And I really want to focus on the investigators because without them, I don't think we would have had the end results we did.
Yeah, it almost sounds like divine intervention.
Yeah, I think so.
It's very interesting. Why do you think that the public tends to focus more on like the murder, for example, for a lot of crimes? I'm trying to think what crimes do we really know? Like, who's the most famous, victim of like a murder? Like the first one that popped into my mind was like Sharon Tate and the Manson family. But why do you think the public tends to focus on the murderer rather than, the victim?
I think they want to know what happened. And to know what happened, you have to focus a little bit more on the murderer themselves and then what they did and how they did it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as a prosecutor, my number one goal is to give a voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. And in these two cases, these victims were silenced permanently. They couldn't speak.
That's a great point. And then another piece that I want to touch on. Can you explain to everyone what a prosecutor is and what's the significance of your role and the type of knowledge that you would have as a prosecutor versus just, like a regular member of the public who's just interested in these types of cases?
Yeah, so when an investigation starts with law enforcement and they're ready to request charges in Michigan, they send a request over to the prosecutor's office. And it's my job and duty at that point to see whether or not we have at least probable cause to believe a crime was committed and a particular suspect or person committed the crime. We also have to look at, can we prove this later? So we have to look at the barrage of evidence that is located through the investigation of law enforcement and say, hey, you know what? Is this going to be enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this person did this? And we want to make sure we can do that because we don't want to walk into something thinking it probably did happen or hoping we can prove it. We need to know that we can. So as a prosecutor, you not only need to review the investigation, but you need to know the law surrounding it. So in these cases, you need to know the laws about murder. You need to know the laws about finding bodies, identification, all kinds of different things. But ultimately, you have to be able to be, the best way I can describe it is like the quarterback, right? The prosecutor is the quarterback of the team, kind of, sometimes you call the plays, sometimes you do the things, and ultimately that's how it will get to the end.
Yeah. And in the state of Michigan, that is an elected position.
It is.
Yes. I don't know if it is. Is it everywhere in the United States?
I'm not sure. I assume there are some elections that probably mostly.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a big deal. You want to have a good prosecutor, and it's county by county in Michigan.
It's county by county, and then the state has an attorney general that's sort of the head prosecutor for the state.
Yep. Yeah. So for the love of God, vote and make sure the prosecutor you're voting for is a good one, because it's a big deal. It's a big position.
It is. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made on cases like this, and we'll get to some of those where I had to make decisions that might have been questioned by some people on this case. But I think that's a teaser. We'll get to those later.
I can't wait to get to those. As part of the overview, is there anything else that you want people to have on their radar or to, have in their mind as they come along on this journey with us, and you start to just give us more details about this case, these cases?
Again, I just really want the focus to be where it should be, which is on the victims, Aundria and Kathleen. And, if people are going to look up the case, certainly they're going to see all the details, but try to focus on them. Try to figure out what you know about them and maybe what questions you might have regarding them and their lives that were shortened.
Is there anything that surprised you about them or their lives, like as a prosecutor investigating?
There was nothing that necessarily surprised me. There were things that I think happened to them where, at least in Aundria's case, she didn't have the support she should have. And in my line of work as a prosecutor, one of the things I specialize in are child sexual assaults. And that's something we'll talk about with regard to Aundria. And I try to champion those causes. As you said, we were working together on a legislation change, and that would tremendously have helped Aundria had those things been in place back in the day.
The amount of people who fall into situations that could lead them to a path similar to Aundria, in theory, there are things that can be done to prevent that. In your line of work, in your opinion, what are some of the main things that can be done to protect people from becoming victims in cases like that?
Well, now we have agencies called child advocacy centers, and those are amazing. They can actually help with law enforcement and do a forensic interview of the child so they can tell what happened to them. But one of the biggest things, and one of the things Aundria didn't have, was advocacy for herself. She had no one to support her. Her adopted mom didn't support her. Her friends did, but there's only so much other teenagers can do. So she didn't feel she had anyone to turn to. And I think that's one of the biggest changes now. Victims who have been victims of sexual abuse or child abuse now have people who will stand up and be a voice for them. And that's really important.
But the need is still so great. So I also work with CACs just as a lobbyist for CACMI. And in conversations I've had with the CACs, I think they've guessed that they serve about 10% of the need that's out there. So, I mean, it's a massive difference. It makes a difference for thousands. But there's still so much more. I mean, how do we, in your opinion, are there ways to bridge that gap to serve more kids, to see more people? Is it just a funding issue? Are there laws that can be changed? Is there a fundamental, and I know I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, is there a fundamental issue with the way that we do the adoption process? Is there something that could be fixed there, in your opinion, from like a legal standpoint, or is a lot of it just financial?
Well, I think in the beginning, the first step is the financial. You have to have the money to be able to fund these agencies and all the support and advocacy that they can give. So that's number one. So if you're ever able to donate to any of those agencies, I think that would be a tremendous support. Number two, I think it's important too for new people to go into those types of careers, whether it's as a forensic interviewer, it's a child therapist, it's an advocate. I think there's a huge shortage of child therapists throughout the state of Michigan, and there's incredibly long wait lists. And that can make it more difficult for a child in need to be able to move past the trauma or get the help that they need. And I think I left out one of your last questions, but I just couldn't remember all three at once.
And I'm drawing a blank on the questions too, because I'm looking at like two different things at once. I'm like, I don't want to go over time. There are a bunch of different things going on. And then obviously I don't want to dive too deep, and we haven't given a ton of detail just because we wanted this episode to sort of be the overview to lead us into some of the more detailed episodes. But is there anything else that you think people should know as part of the overview before we wrap this episode up?
I think it's important too because, we're not only going to talk about the case itself and how it worked and what was in the media and maybe what wasn't, but I think we're going to talk too about the people who handled the cases, right? Because I think that's important. The people that go into careers like this as prosecutors, as law enforcement, as experts in the field, I think we need to talk about how it can affect them, because dealing with these kinds of things every single day can be very difficult. And maybe one of the best ways to alleviate that burden is to be able to talk about it. And that's one of the things I hope we can do, so I can talk about a lot of things and leave it here on the table or in the air, so to speak.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that, you believe that that would be, helpful as a part of, the work that you do and the work that you've done. Are there other things that could be done to support the people that are supporting the victims?
Well, I think that comes, again, just to a funding issue, paying them a better salary so they don't leave to find something else. Unfortunately, historically, prosecutors are paid far less than defense attorneys or other types of lawyers, yet we're doing some of the most very important work. And I don't mean that to say other attorneys aren't important, because they are. But in cases like this, it can be life or death. It can be we convict someone who's been abusing someone, and if we don't convict them, they go back and keep abusing.
Yeah.
So we really need to make that difference.
These are great things to keep in mind and to think about, and maybe there's somebody out there listening that has some sort of idea of how to get additional funding or, changing the way that the state funds the salaries of prosecutors, because it does matter. I mean, if we can't pay people enough to do certain jobs, they don't do those jobs. If we don't get good people doing those jobs, people slip through the cracks. People continue to be, abused, and they become victims. And a lot of times that can become cyclical. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, we do see that. If the cycle's not broken, it may continue for generations to come, whether that person remains to be the victim or sometimes they abuse others. It could go either way. And so that's one of the things in prosecution we want to do, is break that cycle. And to do that, we need to be involved.
Yeah. No. Thank you so much. Is there anything else? I know I asked that like 2 minutes ago as well, but I just want to confirm, double check. There's a lot going on right now.
I just think it's important, to share this information with the public, not only for those who might be curious about cases, but what if there's another victim out there who doesn't know what to do? And I just want to remind all of them that there are people who can help. You just need to reach out. And
where can people reach out to?
They can reach out to their local child advocacy center. They can reach out to their prosecutors' offices, to law enforcement. There are therapists and other agencies out there as well. I'm sure if they reached out to CACMI, they could be, forwarded on to where they need to be. But the bottom line is everybody cares, and we want to help. If you need help, you need to reach out.
I love that. So can we be a little bit more specific just for people? So if someone was listening and they knew someone or they wanted to get help themselves, what's the best way to reach out to CACMI or to the prosecutor's office?
For any prosecutor's office, all of the prosecutor's offices in the state of Michigan have websites, so you can easily look up a number. And when you call, just ask to speak to one of the victim advocates, and they can help point you toward the resources you need. And that's probably one of the best resources that there would be, is to start there, and they can point you to where you need to go after that.
Okay, perfect. If you have any questions, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. Message us on our Instagram page at BTV, Behind the Verdict, _pod.
And if you want more information and really behind the scenes insight on these cases of Aundria Bowman and Kathleen Doyle, then listen to us here on Behind the Verdict.
You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.